We return now to the Boston attacks and what's going on legally for that surviving suspect. We're joined this morning by former prosecutor Anna Yum. Good morning.
Good morning.
And trial attorney Dan Gillian. Good morning.
Morning.
First of all, Johar was not Mirandized. The government pulled some kind of a federal law that says if there's an emergent situation, you don't have to Mirandize right away.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
Well, they just chose not to Mirandize. I mean, it happens all the time. It's just they do it at their own cost. So if they don't Mirandize, then they potentially don't get to have evidence in that they gathered directly from the criminal. So they're not really using what they're citing as a public safety exception, and that one. You know, that one's kind of dicey. I doubt that they're actually going to get away with that.
And Dan raises a really good point, because I practice criminal defense, and one of the most common misconceptions about Miranda is that I have clients who ask me, I was arrested and I was never provided my Miranda rights. Does that mean that my whole case gets dismissed? And that's not true. The Miranda rule, the remedy is to suppress any kind of statements or confession that a defendant makes if he wasn't Mirandized. It doesn't mean that all the evidence gets thrown out the window. And in this case, there appears to be an abundance of evidence, right? The video surveillance of Johar setting down the backpack near the 8-year-old child. We've got bombs being thrown out the window. So in this situation, I think the government's more concerned about gathering intelligence by using this public safety exception, as opposed to really focusing on whether his statements could be admissible in a court of law in the future.
Let's listen to what the Boston Police Commissioner had to say about that whole subject last week.
The decision not to read Miranda rights was made by the federal officials. This is a unique clause to the terrorism law that we've not dealt with at the local level before. So we are standing by and watching that at this point in time to see how that develops. But the lawyers are involved in the decision, and certainly we're very anxious to talk to him, and the investigators will be doing that as soon as possible.
So we know that he was shot in the neck, his throat's not working, and therefore he's answering their questions in handwriting. How do you defend this person? Each of you, if you were suddenly handed that case, Johar has been convicted by the president in a statement. He said, this man went out and did this. How do you possibly defend, or what do you do?
We try to save his life, really. I mean, you're not going to try to prevent a criminal conviction. You're just going to try to work out a deal, save his life. That's really what the job of the defense counsel is going to be.
So Massachusetts has no death penalty.
That's correct.
But the federals do.
Right. So the state of Massachusetts does not have the death penalty, but the federal government does, of course. So if I were the defense attorney in this case, obviously there's some very difficult facts. But as a defense attorney, you need to look at what defenses are available to him. So one that I would look into is perhaps diminished capacity, which is basically legalese for saying that he did it, but he wasn't perhaps of sound mind, or his mind wasn't completely there because of perhaps duress or coercion from his older brother or other psychological influences. It doesn't mean he gets absolved of liability. It just means, like Dan is right, he's not looking at the death penalty, but perhaps a lesser offense which would warrant life in prison.
Do you try to get it moved back into the state of Massachusetts and try to get them to prosecute it that way and not federally?
Well, I mean, not just the state, but keep it in basically the U.S. courts, because right now there's there's a senator out there, McCain, and others are trying to push it into he becomes an enemy combatant, and now he's going to be tried in a military court, which is, you know, I mean, they can do all that. I mean, that would be the fight. You're going to be fighting to keep it in U.S. courts, and then the U.S. courts try to keep it in the state court just to keep the guy alive. That's really, it's going to be a big task for the defense attorney.
Right, and if I'm the defense attorney, you have to see, do I want a change of venue? Is he going to get a fair trial in Massachusetts? Do you try to change the venue like in Timothy McVeigh, how it was tried in Denver as opposed to Oklahoma City? And Dan raises a good point. You have to look at all the factors and all the circumstances when you're the defense. And it's going to be difficult, especially if you're keeping it in federal court as opposed to enemy combatant status, which means he would be tried in a military tribunal. And what's very interesting is that since 9/11, there have been 435 convictions in federal court involving terrorism and terrorists.
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
you had that number right there. That's pretty good. You did your homework, Anna. I appreciate that. Now
Great
then,
representative.
why not, to me, as a layperson, it would seem you walk in there as soon as you possibly can, you cop a plea, and you say, look, we just want to keep this guy alive, and he can tell us a lot, but you just cop a plea right away.
Well, I mean, no one's going to be making any deals right now, especially the prosecutors. And so the prosecutors are going to be figuring out what evidence they have, what's their grand slam? What can they, and they might decide to settle for a solid double with a conviction, and a life sentence, that sort of thing. But right now they're trying to figure out what ballpark they're playing in. There's not going to be any deals for a long time.
I agree with that.
Yeah, he could have bled to death in that boat, and we wouldn't be talking about this now. But this is going to go on for a long, long time. I'm sure we'll be addressing this issue over and over again in the months to come.
It is.
All right, let's go back now to Erica.